Hello, I'm Ren, and today we're going to be covering UMG Leaderboards. I asked a few friend lecturers and a couple of students about what they'd like to cover, and one of the themes that sort of popped up was filling a UMG widget with information dynamically. So we'll do that through this system. So we'll create a save data file which will house the names and scores of each player as they play and finish the game. We'll create a UMG leaderboard which is going to house that information, and a player info widget which is the one that gets added to the leaderboard. And then we'll sort those using arrays and for loops. So at the bottom there we've got a note. Let's talk about for loops and arrays and how we can use those to sort players by their score. So let's get started. We're over here in the tutorial project that I made. So the first thing that we're going to need to make is something for the player to actually write their name down. So that will be a widget. So let's quickly create a user interface for that. We'll just call this leaderboard underscore create name. So if we jump into here, okay, so we've got this UMG now. I'm not going to cover too much of the stuff we've already covered, but anything new that I cover now we'll talk about in a little bit more depth. So the first thing I want to do is actually set this to custom. Give it a size 500 by 300 is fine. And I'm going to start putting some sort of like graphics in here. So we'll have a border that'll fill the screen. We'll change the opacity of this so that we can see the background as well, maybe. And then inside here we're going to want something where we can edit the name of the player at the start of the game. So as they start, this will pop up and it will let them change their name. So we'll put this text box in. And what I'll do is set this to the center. And as we put that hint text in, it will actually expand the size of that. So I'll write type name here, ... And you'll see it's quite small as well, so we can change the font size. In the style drop down, you'll have the style options for everything to do with this type of widget. And basically a text box, which is in the common panel on the left, it's not text, which is the regular text, it's a text box. It has an input. With that input you can control events, so you've got on text changed and on text committed. When people press enter or click off of this widget, it'll leave whatever they've said in there and we'll be able to access that. So straight away in the name I'll actually change that. I'll just call it player name. And then in the font, we mentioned it was a bit small, so maybe we'll change this about 40. Seems a bit large, so we'll type 30. And I think we can change the color of that font. So the font color is black. I think you can change the color here, so we could have it as red, but we'll leave it as black. And I think the background is a little bit light, so I'll go into background image, and maybe I'll make this a little bit less opaque, so 0.5. So now we can see the text pops up a little bit better. And like I was saying, in this editable text box at the bottom, you've got on text committed. So if I click add on that, it will give me a new event in the event graph of this widget, and I'll be able to take that text and apply it to our player and do other events. And what we'll need to do is set up a variable on the player which we can drive this into and set that on the player as this execution pin gets fired once the name is committed. And then we could probably hide this widget, get rid of it, and draw other things. So back in our player, on event begin play, we can set some, we can draw that widget, and then we could have some variables on the left hand side for the score and the name of the player. So let's set those up. We'll have my name for the player's name, and we'll give that a string, and we'll also have my score, which we'll have as an integer. So the player's now got a name and a score variable associated with him in his own settings. So again, this is the actual player, and in the variables of this player he has a name and a score. So this will get set at the beginning of the game, but we need to actually create the widget. So let's create LB create name, and then we need the basic sort of like settings for this widget. So we'll grab that from the level blueprint from a previous tutorial. We've got all these settings here, so we'll grab all of this, we'll copy that, go back to our player. We could probably delete this for now, and instead of drawing this slot, we'll draw the LB underscore create name. And then we just need to pick where we're going to actually display that. So it's going to be the center of the screen. So the alignment will be 0.5 on both. The anchors will be 0.5 across the board. The position is going to be the center of the screen. So it will be the X and the Y divided by 2. And then the desired size was 500 by 300. And then we'll add that to the viewport. But another thing that we'll do now as well, what we could do actually is move this function into this new area I've created for all of my widgets that get drawn. So this is a comment box. You can create those just by pressing C in the viewport, and then you just drag it over what you want it to cover. Or similarly, you can drag over what you want this comment box to cover and press C, and I'll call this draw widgets. So this will be anything that gets drawn to the viewport, and I'll give this its own event. So this is going to be a custom event, and I'll call it draw name. So this will be the draw name custom event, and that will happen on begin play. So if I go back to begin play and do draw name, thou now fire that event. If I double click that, it takes me to it. So this will create the name, it will set it up in the viewport, and another thing that we want to do is actually save a variable for this, which means that we can remove it once it's done. So off of this return value just here, what we can do is we can pull off of it, and then you'll see promotes a variable. So this will be my name widget, and it's come over here, so I'll put that at the end. So now we have a reference to that. Back in the create name, what we need to do is get the player, and we can do this from most classes. So get player pawn, and we can cast it to the specific character, so it's my new character. And that means we can access variables like we could set my score, or we could set my name, and we could also get the get my name widget, and then remove from parent, which is going to remove it from the viewport after it's been drawn. So what we'll do is we'll set my name to be equal to this text here, and it will convert the text type into a string type, so that will go into the player nicely, and then it will remove itself from the viewport. But what we also want to do is draw a few other things. As soon as you've done that, we'll probably want to draw the score. So in the player, I've already set this one up. We've got UMG score. That's just its own little widget. It's got some it's got an integer on there. It's linked to this my score variable. So if we go and check that, just here in the content browser, I've got UMG score. It's just a canvas panel with a border and a text inside it, and this text is bound. So just on the top right here, you can see this bind. We've created these kind of bindings before. So what it does is it has a reference to the player. It gets the score from that player. So I'll just make sure that's the correct one, get my score. So I'll set that up like that. And then it just creates an append for that string. So it always says score plus whatever the score was. So it's score with a space. So we have a little space in there. And then it puts the score at the end. So it actually appears as it appears here, but with a number at the end. And in the event graph of this score, it just gets the player pawn again. Like I said, we can get that from anywhere. We cast it to the character and we save a reference just by pulling off and promoting that to a variable, or right clicking on that return value once we've cast it and promoting it to a variable. You'll see it on the left hand side, reference for the player. So we can now get that and bind it. So it's bound in the viewport here in the designer on the right hand side. So that's all set up, and we just need to draw that. So I've already set that up here. It draws at the top of the screen. It's got some settings to draw it at the top. And back in create name, what we could do here, once this has been removed from the viewport, we could then draw score. So I should be able to jump into the game now, and what I'll actually do is, as draw score gets called, at the very end I'll just make sure that the name has been set by printing my name. So if I save that, jump in, you'll see it's in the center of the screen here. I'll click it and type in my name is Ren, and then it prints it on the top left there, my name is Ren. You notice it did it twice as well. So what I think we could do is just double check in here how many times this is getting called. So print string hello, and then when I press play, type in name is, it does do it twice, so it's saying hello hello. So this committed is actually happening twice. So what I could do is put a do once in here, and this is just a node that forces the rest of the execution to only ever happen once. If it is in the event graph like this will only ever happen once until it's reset again by certain things. So I could reset it at the end, or reset it from somewhere else like this, like a different function. You can start it closed as well, so it has to be opened by something. It's like a bit of a gate, essentially. But now, when I press play and type in my name, you'll see it only ever happens once. So that's that sorted. We only ever set the name once, and we only ever draw the score once, because otherwise at the end here it would draw this score twice. So now that we've done that, I can probably get rid of that print string. The next thing that we want to create is a leaderboard. And just to go over something quickly, I've got this collectible here, and in the viewport it's just a ball with a trigger sphere around it. It's a little bit larger so that you can get into an area that's near it, touch it, and then an event will happen. So on this sphere I've got onComponentBegin overlap, and that casts the actor that's overlapping it to the player, and if it is the player it runs this pin. If it isn't the player it'll just fail. But if it is the player, we can add score, which is a function I've made in the player, and then we can destroy the actor. It's currently got nothing in it. So if we get my score, so this gets the reference to the current score. So if this has been updated at any time, it'll be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then we can add an integer to this of 1. So every time you touch something and this gets called, we add 1 to it. And then if we alt drag this into the viewport, or pull it in and press set, what we'll be doing is basically every time you add score is we're setting the score to whatever the score was, add 1, and then it will give us the score add 1 basically, and set it again. So every time this runs, it could be 1 add 1 2, then 2 add 1 3, 3 add 1 4, and so on. So that's basic score, and that's just going to keep updating my score there, and then the score widget is reading from that and constantly updating on the top of the screen. So I think in this test level I've got a couple of these laid out already. So if I press play now, actually I've just noticed as well that if I click I can actually control the player. So if I go into my player quickly and just set something up for that. So at the beginning of the game, when we draw the name, one of the things we're going to want to do at the end here is actually make it so the cursor is shown and the player can't get controlled. And I've already got a can control boolean, which is branching off of all of the inputs and basically saying if it's false, if can control is false, don't allow anything to happen. If it's true, allow us to control the player. So what I need to do is set can control to false when the draw name comes up, and set it to true once that's finished. So we'll do that there. And we also need to set it up so that the mouse cursor shows at the beginning. So get player controller, and from the player controller we can set show cursor, so that'll be true. We'll plug that in, and then we also want it to be false once that's finished, so we'll set that to false. Now if we press play, click, nothing happens. We can click on here, we can type in James, and then we can start running into these. You'll see the score updates as I walk into these. And that's pretty much it so far. So now what we need to do is set an end point. So I'll just do that on a keybind, and when you press K it will save some data and draw it to a leaderboard. So let's actually create that save data. So inside our content browser again, in our new folder, what I'll do is create a new blueprint class, go to all classes and type in save. And I've covered this in another tutorial, but we'll go over it a bit here. So essentially what this is it's data that gets saved to the system and can be read from, and this is just the class that holds the information. So we'll call this lb_save data, and inside here is where we're going to hold all of the information that's going to be in that save. So it's essentially going to be all of the players' names and all of the players' scores every time a new player plays the game. So up on the left hand side here in variables, what we'll do is we'll create player names, and this is going to be of the type string, and we'll also create player scores, and this will be of the type integer. So it's relative to the my name and my score from the player itself, and we'll be driving those values into here. But you'll notice that this is just one variable, it just holds one name, so this might be my name. But what we want it to do is actually hold a list of them, and that's where arrays come into play. So if anyone's used arrays before, they'll know that it's a list of the same type from 0 to the length. So variable type at the top, you'll see string, and you'll see this little 9 box just next to it. So make this variable type of array. If I click that and then compile, you'll see on the left hand side it's changed from a little capsule to the array icon. And you'll also see on the right hand side underneath default value, you've got player names and it's got these elements. And what we're essentially going to do every time the player finishes the game is add their name and their score to this array and then draw it into a leaderboard. So this could be Ren and Dave and Steve and so on. So I'll just empty that array. It's going to start completely empty, and this is basically it for the save data. Oh, sorry, one thing we do need to do is actually make player scores an array as well. So they're both lists, and they'll essentially be relative because player name 0 will be, you know, Ren, and then player score 0 will be Ren's score, so it will be 2 or 4. So we'll close that down, and back in our new character we'll have to sort of like load that at the beginning of the game and make sure that we have a reference to it. Although in fact we could just do that when the end of the game happens. So what I'll do is when you press K, it will end the game essentially. So the first thing we want to do is check for a save game. So we've done this in a previous video, but I'll run over it again. So it's the first thing you want to do is ask if a save game exists, and what it does is it asks for a slot name. So I'll call this LB, and every time you check LB, it's going to ask if there's anything existing in the slot of LB, and there's a text file somewhere in the system which has that name, and it's checking for that. So you can branch at the end, and if it's true you can load from it. If it's false and LB doesn't exist, we're going to need to create it. So we'll do that first. So what we do is we create a save game object, and we select our LB save data. So that save data that we just made, and then what we can do is we can cast it to our specific type. So it was LB save data, and you'll see now I can get player names and player scores because we have the cast type and we can get its variables from there. So what we want to do once we've actually created that save game object, we could promote it to a variable called my LB save. And what we want to do once we've created it is actually save it back to the system. So we can save a slot, and again we'll have to use the same name. So if LB doesn't exist, create a save object and then save it to LB, and it's going to be this my save for the leaderboard. And that's pretty much it for creating a new save. That's just created it. We haven't put any data in there yet. We're just waiting. And if we'll basically fix that up once we've created the leaderboard. But over here in this branch, if the save data does exist, what we can do is load from the slot. So again, the slot name is LB because LB does exist. So we want to get that. Then we want to cast it again. Make sure that we have the correct type that we set up. So again, you can get specific things from here, like the player names and the player score that we set up in that save file. We'll set the reference, the local reference to that save up again, and we've just loaded it and set it up, and that's pretty much it for now. So when you end the game, we'll load the data, and that means that any data that we saved previously, we'll be able to get that and then add to the array. So what we could do actually is we could get player names and we could get the scores, and at the end of the game we want to drag off this array and add to it. And there's a bunch of different things you can do to an array, so I'll just quickly show that as well because I said we'd talk about arrays. So if I go to utilities, after dragging off that array pin, go into array, you've got add, append, clear, a boolean for does it contain something, and we'll go through these quickly. So if you add something to it, which is exactly what we're going to do, you essentially add to the end of the array. So say the array is 2 elements long, that'll be 0 and 1 inside the array, and then we're going to add my name to it, so that will become the 3rd element in the array. So we'll do that, and then we'll also do an add to the score and add my score to that array. So both of these arrays are always going to be relative to each other. So other things that we can do with these arrays, let's have a look. We'll have a look at this a bit more later as well. We can insert to it. If I go to utilities and array again, we can get, and that will allow us to check a certain element in that array. So we could get element 3. We could also, so we can add, we can clear, which basically empties the array. We can ask if it contains an item, and you'll see, does it contain this specific name, and then you'll have a condition which you can branch from. There's a bunch of other stuff you can do as well, so we'll just go through that. Find item. You could find the array element of a specific name, and it will give you the index of that if it exists within there. You can do a for each loop off of every one of those names, which we'll be doing later. We can insert an element, and that allows you to insert a certain name at a certain point in that array. So if the array is 3 elements long, and you put this at 1, it'll insert it at the second point. So 0 and 1 will still exist, so Ren and James will exist. And if you insert at element 1, you'll insert it after Ren, and then it will be like Steve, and then it will be James. So that's what insert does. It puts it at a specific point in the array. We can get the length of it as well. So when we do a for loop, if we didn't do for each, which will actually loop through every element in this array, if we did a for loop, which is just based off numbers, we could use the length to control how many times to loop through it. We can resize it, shuffle it. Shuffling is quite cool if you're doing some randomization. And yeah, so that's a bunch of things that you can do with arrays. So what we're doing is actually just getting the arrays for each of those that are inside our loaded file. So anything that existed previously from a save data, we're then adding our name and our score that's been created this match. So in this local gameplay session, we're adding those to that array. And then what we want to do is save a game to the slot again. So the slot again is called LB, and the save data that we're saving is this one here that we've actually added to. So we've got a reference to that. We'll just drag it in. So now that'll actually save. So that's pretty much it for setting that up. I'll actually rename this to my LB. So that's set up on all of those now. So the next thing we want to do is actually create the leaderboard asset. So what we could do is right click, go to user interface, go to widget, and create the LB underscore leaderboard. So I realise that's leaderboard, but I won't worry about that. So what we could do is create a scroll box. We'll create this scroll box. We'll set it to a custom size. So this is going to be the width that I want it to be. So I'll have it at 500 by 800. And inside this scroll box, we'll actually change some of the details. So the scroll box is going to be called scrollbox underscore player info. It's going to be a variable. And that's pretty much it for this. What we're going to do is add to this. And inside the graph, what we could do is create a custom event. We'll call this add data. And in this custom event, we could have 2 inputs. So on the left hand side, when you click a custom event, you can add inputs to it. So we'll add 2 new inputs, and we'll have these as player names and player scores. And if I then go to this boolean here and set it instead to an integer, a string on the player names and an integer on the player scores, and then set them both to arrays, you'll see that these now have outputs for the player names and the player scores. And we'll call this from the player class. When we load that information in and we save the new player's name to it, we'll actually put it into this. We'll use it as an input, and then as this gets called, it will transfer all that information over to here. So what we want to do now is just for loop off of one of these. So I said we'll go over the for loop, and basically what this does is for every element in that array, which will at least have 1 because the player that just ended the game will be in that array, So that'll just do it once, and it will call this body once. But if there were 10 elements in that array for the 10 players that have ever played the game, it will loop through 10 times, once for each of those. And this pin, you'll see it's the same color, so that's the actual string of that element, and this is the index of that element. And what we can do with that index is get from this player scores here, we could get the relative index. So this name has an index inside this array, and in this array of scores you'll be able to get the same index, which basically means element 0 has a name, element 0 from the get scores, which is in here now, will also have a number, and they'll be the same player, right? So once you've done that, you'll want to create a new widget, and we actually have to set that widget up, so let's go and do that as well. And this is the widget that's going to get added to the leaderboard. So what we'll do is go down to user interface, create lb_player info, and inside player info again we're going to make it custom. We know that our leaderboard is 500 units wide and it has a height of 100 in this case for this player asset. So what we'll do is we'll delete the canvas panel, we will put a size box in there, and the reason we do this is so that we can set the height to always be 100 units. So even though this is set here, when you add children to a box like on this leaderboard, as we add elements to this, if it doesn't have a desired height, sometimes it just spawns in with no height, so you can't actually see the elements. So we'll have that size box inside this new widget item that we'll add to that, and then inside this size box we'll have a horizontal box, and this will have two pieces of text inside it, so we'll put those two text blocks in. What we can do is we can select them both and set them both to fill inside their details panel, and we can set their alignment up to be centered. So this left hand one is going to be the name, and the right hand one is going to be the score. And all I need to do now is actually bind these up, or just set them at the beginning to be the name of each of those items. And what I could do is actually grab this horizontal box and wrap it with a border. So we've wrapped in one of the last videos. You notice it comes in white, so we need to change the brush color on the right hand side. And I might actually make that slightly transparent, so we'll go for 0.2. So that will be our score item that gets drawn to that leaderboard. And in the graph now, as it gets constructed, what I could do is have two variables, one for the new name to spawn and one for the score to spawn. So these could both be relative to what they should be again, so integer and string. And what you can do is you can make these both editable by clicking those eyes, and then at the bottom, if you click expose on spawn, what essentially happens is, back in our leaderboard, in the graph, when we create that lb_player info, you'll see that the exposed on spawn variables are now actually exposed, and we can just drag some of this information in. So every time we create a new asset, we'll put those pieces of information into them. And then on construct, all we need to do now is get these two text blocks, make them variables, make sure this one's called name and this one's called score. Click on the variable icons, and back in the graph, we know from previous videos again that these are now, we can get them and we can start setting things on them. So we'll set the text on both of these like so, and because those two variables are exposed on spawn, as this gets created on event construct, we'll be able to actually reference them. So we'll set the name in the name text box, so that'll be that, and then we'll get the score here. We'll drag this into that text, and it has a couple of options in this drop down. Is it grouped? So if your score was over 1,000, it'll have a comma for the 1,000, and then the rest of the digits will just be normal. So that's how that's done, and that basically should be it for the player info. All we need to do now is actually get that scroll box. So in our designer, this scroll box here is a variable of scroll box player info, and then what you can do is you can add child to that, and it asks for some content. So that's going to be the new widget that we created, and that should be pretty much it. The only thing we haven't done is sorted it So we'll leave this as it is for now, and what we want to do back in my new character, as we press K and end the game, what we essentially want to do is draw another widget to the screen. We want to probably remove the score. So what we need to do again is promote this to a variable, the score. So we'll call this my score widget, and we'll put this over to the right hand side, and we'll create a new custom event, which is going to be to draw the leaderboard. So draw leaderboard, and the first thing we'll do is actually remove the score widget from the parent, so that will no longer be drawn to the screen, but we'll draw the leaderboard next. So we want something that's drawn in the center of the screen, so I know that this one is drawn at the center of the screen. So we'll grab that, we'll just put that here like this, and essentially what we could do here, we should be able to change this to leaderboard, so lb underscore leaderboard, and then we should be able to call was it set data, add data, and then we've got that player name and player score input. So we'll do that at the end. I'll just quickly check that all of these are set up correctly. So it was 500 by 800 on the size. It's drawn to the center of the screen, so that's all fine. And then we set up this data. So what I need to do is get my save data and get the two pieces of information from those, and just drive them into that new custom function that we made. So back in the leaderboard now, we'll find this add data function. So that's this one that we made. It's got those two inputs at the bottom left, and then it's going to read from those, add all the children to the viewport based on that. So now all I need to do is actually call this draw leaderboard at a specific point in time. And as we press K, we check if the data exists. If it doesn't, we create the data, and then we're going to want to draw the leaderboard after that. We're also going to want to add, we're going to want to do this again here. So if the save data doesn't exist, we need to create it, but we also need to add ourselves to that. So if I just drag all of these pins in like this, this will make sure that everything is set up once we've created that new save. So it's added our current name and our current score to it, and then the next time it runs, it'll actually go up this way and it will load those names. And you'll see here we're adding to it, but it will have no elements at the beginning. And again, we want to draw the leaderboard once this save game data has been set. So that should be it. It removes the score widget, it draws the leaderboard, and then the leaderboard adds data, which is going to draw each of these individual elements. So I should be able to press play, type in Ren as my name. If I press K, you'll see Ren is there at the top. So now if I jump in and I type Dave, and then actually go and get some score, so I'll pick up 2, and then you've got Ren and Dave. You'll notice they're not ordered. So the next thing we'll do is actually create an ordering thing for this. So we'll do that inside this leaderboard asset. So as this information comes in, we'll actually sort this array. Okay, so I've gone ahead and coded this, and the reason I've done that is because it is quite complex, and talking over it whilst making it isn't a great way to do it. So what I'll do is actually just explain how this works now that it's complete. So one of the problems first back in the player was that this slot name, where it was saving to and loading from, wasn't the same. So I've made it a variable. It's called lb underscore slot1, and that means that saving and loading and sort of like everywhere that this name is referenced, whether it exists or not, and all this sort of stuff, all references the same name. So there's no discrepancies there, and that was one of the problems I was having. It wasn't loading and saving properly. So now that that is working, we can go to the leaderboard, we can go down here, and this is all set up here inside the local save, so that works, and it goes to add data. So in add data, what we do is we get the player names and player scores, and we save them as local variables. We then loop through that local variable, so we get that local array that we've just made as a copy essentially of the information from the save data, and then we loop through that, and each time we loop through it we're asking a couple of questions. Is something more than or less than the previous or next values? So we'll have a look at what this does. So we have a current index which is used pretty much everywhere. So you'll see it here, you'll see it here, and you'll see it getting incremented here. So the idea of that current index is that that's where we're looping from at the moment, and you'll see this this repeat here. So every time this runs through, current index is getting changed based on a certain condition. So we'll just run through this and sort of like cover these points as they come. So the first question is whether inside a sorted score array, which will be empty when this starts, it asks if the current index, which will be 0, is valid. So is 0 valid? Essentially this will be no every time this runs the first time. So what it does is it just adds the element from this reference to our score list. It adds the first element of that into the array. So we have a sorted scores and a sorted names array. So the way this sorts is you either add or insert. So if the first element doesn't exist, then we just add it to the array, which essentially means it's going to become element 0. So we do that for both the score and the name. We add our local last score, which will essentially be this number, which comes out of the array element. So as the for loop runs, 0, just add that to the new score array. And then the new sorted names, it just gets that reference that we set back here, last names. It gets the same array element from here. So we use the array index at this point, and we get from last names, which is the stored one, and we add that to the new sorted array. So now we have the first element in our scores and names that are going to be drawn later on. So the next thing we do is we essentially finish. It just finishes, and then it goes on to the next element just here. So this body has essentially finished there. Nothing happens after that, and then it goes on to array element 1. So in here, the next element in this array, it will set the current index to 0. It will ask if 0 exists. This time it will be true. So what we need to do is check whether that element that exists there is more than the first element. So the reason current index is 0 so that we can check against the first element in the array. Because it exists, we can basically get that from the sorted scores and ask if, just here in this condition, you'll see it's asking if I hover over that, it will tell us what it is. So in the for loop, so we're now onto the second element, or the first numbered element. So it's going to ask if that number, that score, is more than the first sorted score that we added at the beginning. And if that's true, it is more than, then we want to insert it at the beginning. So what we do is we use current index again, and we just checked against it. So we're checking current index, which will be 0. Let's say it is more than 0, so we add it into its place. So we use the same current index, 0, and we insert the new score, which again is this one that comes out the for loop, and we insert it into the array. So it becomes the first element, and the other one basically gets shifted down one. And then we add the names again. So we use the last name array, and we use the index again to get the correct one, and then we insert that to the names array. So let's say that the new element here is score 1, and the last one is score 2. So this would be false because it's not more than or equal to, it's actually less than. So the idea is we branch, and we ask if the current index, which could technically be 1, and then we add 1 to that, is that more than the length of sorted scores minus 1? And what this bit of math here is basically saying is, are there enough elements in the array for me to actually overwrite or insert? And if this is true, it basically means that the thing that we're trying to check against is essentially at the end of the array, so we may as well just add it. So if this returns true, we just add it to the end of the array, and if it's false, it basically says, okay, well, there is an element there, we are less than it, so let's increase the current index, because what's essentially happening is we're now going to check the next one, and we're going to keep going until this is true. So essentially what we're doing is we're sifting for this event, which says that the current number that we're checking, so 1, is more than or equal to the currently checked one. And as soon as that becomes true, so 2 is equal to 2, then it's like, okay, cool, so we can just insert that now and put that in that certain slot. Otherwise, try and put it on the next one, try and put it on the next one, and if the next one doesn't exist, just add it, and if the next one does exist, then increment the current index, go back to here and check against the index just here, and essentially it just keeps running that same loop. So I'll just leave that on screen like this for a second, just so you guys can sort of like take that in, and I'll just move it over a bit and sort of just, you see how all this works. So, and then you've got this for loop again, so once it gets completed, once it's gone through every element in this array and it's sorted out the names and the new scores, it then just runs through sorted names and sorted scores and sets up those widgets. So if I jump in now, and I'll call this ren4, and I go and get a load of score, so we'll just run through here and then press K, you'll see it's 5410. So it's sorted that out, it's put my current player at the very top, and if I go in again and press play and I call this ren5 and I only get 1 score, press K, you'll see ren5 is lower down the list, and again the previous play which had 5 scores at the top, and then so on. So that's kind of how you do leaderboards. It's a bit complex, but it does show you how to sort out information into widgets. So I'll post this video up, and hopefully it will help a couple of people dynamically adding things to the array. So that pretty much wraps up the leaderboards. I know they're pretty complex, but hopefully you'll be able to make some really cool stuff in your games based on that kind of array sifting information, like randomization as well could be part of that. But you could also create your own leaderboards now, so that would be pretty useful for some of your small games. So thanks very much everyone, and good luck game deving. See you later.